Welcome to Two Histories, where every story has two sides. I'm James Whitfield.
And I'm Norwin Lee. Today we're exploring the First Opium War.
The Opium War sounds like it starts with opium, but the deeper problem was trade, silver, and power between Britain and the Qing Empire.
Right. And to understand why it happened, we have to start with a British obsession, tea.
Exactly. In the late 18th century, British demand for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain was massive. It was a cultural staple.
But the Qing Empire was largely self-sufficient. Chinese merchants did not want British manufactured goods in return.
That created a massive trade imbalance. British merchants were bleeding silver to pay for their tea habit.
To manage foreign influence, the Qing state restricted all Western maritime commerce to a single southern port, Canton or Guangzhou.
That framework was known as the Canton System. From London's view, it was a frustrating, corrupt barrier.
Why did British private merchants hate it so much?
Because they were forced to deal exclusively with a state-sanctioned merchant guild called the Ko Hong or Gong Hang, they had no direct access to Qing officials.
So from Beijing's side, that system was essential for internal security. Foreign trade was viewed as a privilege granted by imperial benevolence, not an absolute right.
And that created intense friction. British merchants, animated by free trade economics, hated being treated as inferior subjects. They wanted diplomatic equality.
But the Qing court simply did not recognize the Western concept of diplomatic equality. They operated on a tributary model.
So we have two totally incompatible legal and economic systems colliding, and the British urgently needed a commodity to reverse their silver drain.
Yes, they found opium. Recreational smoking existed in China before, with early bans in 1729. But what happened next was an industrial-scale catastrophe.
British records, like the MIT Visualizing Cultures materials, show how the East India Company essentially industrialized the narcotics trade. They held a strict monopoly on poppy cultivation in Bengal.
They grew the opium, packaged it, and auctioned it to private traders. Those private traders then smuggled it to the Chinese coast in fast ships.
This was not a small side business. The East India Company relied on this opium revenue to fund their administration in India.
It created a highly lucrative triangular trade. Indian opium went to China, Chinese tea went to Britain.
And British revenue funded their expanding global empire.
But inside China, it caused a mass addiction epidemic. Modern drug control overviews note this scale shift was unprecedented.
And the macroeconomic damage was just as severe. The flow of silver completely reversed. Instead of pouring into China, it was bleeding out.
That is the part people miss. Everyday transactions used copper cash, but taxes had to be paid in silver.
So, as silver flowed out of the empire, its value skyrocketed relative to copper cash.
Exactly. Peasants effectively had to pay double to meet their tax burden. The drug trade was literally bankrupting the rural economy.
I can clearly see why the Qing state finally panicked. But the British merchants in Canton were deeply divided on how to handle the growing tension.
Not all of them wanted to force the issue, did they?
No. Archival research details a faction known as the Warlike Party. Led by William Jardine and James Matheson, they pushed a fierce pro-war agenda.
They used their local newspaper, the Canton Register, to argue for smashing the Canton System.
Right. They believed British trade expansion was a right. But there was also a Pacific Party who published the Canton Press.
They advocated for peaceful engagement. The Pacific Party believed China was a sovereign nation with the right to enforce its own laws.
Unfortunately, the Warlike Party was much better connected in London. They lobbied hard, deliberately framing the conflict not around drugs, but around national honor.
There was also a massive linguistic dispute fueling this tension. The Qing court commonly used the term yi to describe the British in official documents.
And British translators increasingly rendered yi as barbarian. The British took it as a massive insult to their national dignity.
But historians point out that yi simply meant foreigners from beyond the inner lands. It did not necessarily carry the pejorative sting the British claimed.
That changes the picture completely. The Warlike Party leveraged a translation dispute to justify gunboat coercion.
And to push back against the restrictions, they tried to bypass the Kohong entirely. This led to incidents where British merchants defied local regulations and sent ships up the northern coast.
From London's view, the Canton System was just an arbitrary barrier. William Jardine actually drafted what became known as the Jardine Plan.
What did that plan entail?
It was a detailed strategy to blockade the Chinese coast, demand compensation, and secure treaty ports. He presented it directly to Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston.
So the merchants were practically drafting British foreign policy. That explains why the Qing state felt so threatened. Official communications show the Dao Guang emperor engaged in a serious policy debate.
Right. Some officials wanted to legalize and tax opium to control it, but realizing the empire faced financial ruin, the emperor decided on strict prohibition.
To enforce that, the emperor appointed Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner in 1839. Lin arrived in Canton with extraordinary powers to eradicate the trade entirely.
Lin was incredibly systematic. He did not just target the foreign smugglers in his initial sweep, right?
No, he tackled the domestic side first. He arrested thousands of local opium smokers and confiscated tens of thousands of pipes to kill the demand. He even set up rehabilitation programs.
British merchants usually assumed they could just bribe their way through crackdowns, but Lin bypassed the usual corruption.
He directly targeted the foreign merchants in the 13 factories. He demanded they surrender all their opium stocks immediately.
He also demanded they sign a bond promising never to smuggle again, under penalty of death. To the British, this was an outrageous overreach.
But to the Qing state, these foreign merchants were simply criminals operating illegally within Chinese territory. Lin blockaded the factories to force compliance.
That blockade forced Charles Elliot, the British Superintendent of Trade, to act. He ordered the merchants to hand their opium over to him.
Wait, why did he do that, rather than let them surrender it directly to Lin Zexu?
It was a brilliant, if cynical, legal maneuver. By taking the opium on behalf of the Crown, Elliot transformed private smuggled goods into British state property.
That is a massive shift. So when Elliot surrendered over 20,000 chests to Lin Zexu, it was no longer just a police action against private smugglers.
Exactly. It became a dispute between two sovereign nations. Elliot essentially guaranteed the merchants would be compensated by the British government.
In June 1839, Lin Zexu destroyed all 20,000 chests at the beaches of Humen. He mixed the opium with salt and lime, flushing it into the sea.
That must have been a staggering sight.
For Lin Zexu, the destruction at Humen was a triumphant moment of law enforcement. He even offered a prayer to the sea spirit, apologizing for the poison.
But the British free traders did not see it as law enforcement. They saw it as theft. Jardine used this event to convince London that China was acting lawlessly, arguing they were simply supplying a willing market.
It really shows how completely disconnected their legal philosophies were. Lin assumed the foreigners would respect imperial law once he showed he was serious.
And Elliot assumed that by making it crown property, he was protecting British citizens from arbitrary justice.
But it just guaranteed a war. Before the military arrived, Lin Zexu tried diplomacy. He wrote a famous letter of advice to Queen Victoria, arguing from a standpoint of universal moral justice.
The letter is a fascinating document. How exactly did Lin frame his argument to the British monarch? Did he appeal to international law?
No, he focused on moral reciprocity. He pointed out that Britain banned or restricted opium at home, knowing its harm. He asked how they could justify exporting that poison.
I believe he explicitly asked, "Where is your conscience?" He also highlighted that China exported beneficial goods like tea and silk.
Exactly. Receiving only harmful drugs in return. He treated trade as a privilege granted by the Qing state, not an inherent right.
But tragically, he wrote in a hierarchical Qing idiom that British officials rejected as insulting. Because of that diplomatic mismatch, the letter never even reached Queen Victoria.
Meanwhile, back in London, Parliament was fiercely divided over the crisis. Was the British establishment fully unified behind going to war to protect drug smugglers?
Not at all. The official Hansard records show intense moral criticism from within the government. In 1840, William Ewart Gladstone delivered a blistering speech to Parliament.
He denounced the opium traffic as infamous and atrocious, right?
Absolutely. Gladstone argued the Chinese had every right to drive the smugglers from their coasts. He warned the impending war would cover Britain with permanent disgrace.
That internal debate is fascinating. Post-war records even show Protestant missionary organizations petitioning Parliament to abolish the East India Company's opium monopoly entirely.
It shows that moral opposition existed in civil society. But the imperial logic of free trade and revenue ultimately won out.
So, from London's view, how did Lord Palmerston justify the expedition if they deliberately avoided the topic of the opium itself?
They emphasized national honor, property rights, and commercial security, which completely ignored the human cost. The Warlike Party argued British subjects had been imprisoned and their lawful property confiscated without a fair trial.
So they painted the Canton System as an arbitrary, corrupt barrier that needed to be smashed by military force so free trade could flourish.
Right. The parliamentary vote to fund the military expedition passed by a razor-thin margin of only 9 votes. The war was officially justified as a demand for diplomatic equality.
In the summer of 1840, the British Expeditionary Force arrived. The military conflict quickly revealed a massive technological gap between the two empires.
Advanced British steamships, like the iron-hulled Nemesis, easily destroyed traditional Chinese war junks. They captured coastal positions and occupied Hong Kong.
They also blockaded key rivers and threatened the Grand Canal. But we cannot just blame the Qing defeat on inferior weaponry.
That sounds counterintuitive. Reading British military accounts, Qing strategy often seems totally disconnected from reality. How do historians explain their decision-making?
East Asian historians point to the structural decay of the Qing military. Troops were scattered locally to maintain internal order.
So they could not mount a concentrated defense against a highly mobile naval force?
Exactly. And the political system itself was deeply flawed. Generals were terrified of telling the emperor the truth about their devastating battlefield losses.
Wait, they were lying to the emperor about losing battles?
Yes, Qing generals would suffer terrible defeats, but then write memorials claiming glorious victories. This created an absolute information vacuum in Beijing.
The emperor was making decisions based on complete fabrications. The British were capturing cities, while the Dao Guang emperor was reportedly asking his advisors if England shared a land border with Russia.
The Qing court treated the British not as a modern foreign military, but as local coastal rebels. They vacillated wildly between aggressive suppression and desperate conciliation.
That institutional blindness is staggering. The Qing simply lacked the vocabulary and the conceptual framework of European international law to handle this crisis.
This became incredibly apparent during the peace settlement. When they finally capitulated in August 1842, the negotiations for the Treaty of Nanking were filled with intense psychological pressure.
The Qing negotiators, Qi Ying and Lu Pu, did not speak English. They had to rely entirely on British translators, like John Robert Morrison.
That put them at a severe disadvantage. Recent academic studies show how the Chinese versions of the treaty were carefully manipulated.
To reconcile military defeat with preserving imperial face?
Exactly. They framed devastating territorial and financial concessions to the British as acts of imperial benevolence rather than enforced submissions.
The British negotiators used that to their advantage, embedding their imperial priorities into the text. The Treaty of Nanking was the first of what Chinese historiography calls the unequal treaties.
The terms were severe. It opened 5 treaty ports to unrestricted British trade, including Shanghai and Canton, and explicitly abolished the Kohong monopoly.
It also imposed a massive $21 million indemnity on the Qing. Crucially, $6 million of that was explicitly compensation for the destroyed opium.
And Article 3 ceded Hong Kong Island to the British Crown in perpetuity. This provided a secure, deep-water base off the coast.
But what is perhaps most telling is what the treaty left out entirely. The word opium does not appear anywhere in the text of the Treaty of Nanking.
That is incredible. The British negotiators deliberately left the drug trade unresolved to avoid domestic backlash back home and public outrage in China.
So the smuggling continued without interference. Only now it was protected by the shadow of British gunboats.
For China, it marked the beginning of the Century of Humiliation. Tariff autonomy was stripped away completely.
The local agency and sovereignty of the Qing state were severely compromised. Soon, the United States negotiated the Treaty of Wangshire.
France followed suit with the Treaty of Whampoa. This was not just a British victory, it established a broader Western treaty port pattern that aggressively opened Chinese markets.
The Canton System was completely dead. China was forcibly integrated into the Western-dominated global capitalist economy. They got their ports, their island, and their compensation.
The conflict was a profound historical tragedy, driven by the ruthless logic of free trade. It was a collision of two entirely different worldviews.
On one side, an agrarian, land-based empire. On the other, an expanding, industrialized maritime empire.
The moral stain of the opium trade lingered. The modern international drug control regime traces its roots directly back to this global reaction.
Lin Zexu remains a revered patriot in China for his principled stand.
But his Confucian moralism was ultimately powerless against the harsh realities of 19th century imperial capitalism.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment.
Find us on YouTube at 2 Histories. Hit the bell for updates.
Thanks for watching 2 Histories. I'm James Whitfield.
And I'm Norwin Lee. See you next time.